Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you had a fantastic Thanksgiving in some way, shape, or form with your friends and your family. I know that in 2020, there's a lot going on, but we still have so much to be thankful for, like fried turkey. Is there any other way to eat Thanksgiving turkey? I submit to you, there is not. However, I did discover last week that a surprising number of Americans have an entirely different food as the Thanksgiving star. And I bet I could give you 10 guesses of what it is, and you would still be stumped. It's not ham, it's not steaks, it's not Cornish hens or chickens, it's meatloaf. That's right, meatloaf. I was blown away when I Googled it, just how many recipes are out there for Thanksgiving meatloaf. I know the debates rage every year. Is it stuffing or is it dressing? Do you do the cranberry sauce, the chunky stuff, or do you do the can, that wibbles and wobbles and comes right out of the can and never changes its shape? Well, now you can add to those debates turkey or meatloaf. Now, chances are meatloaf was not the star of your Thanksgiving in 2020, but did you know that another kind of meatloaf was at the top of the charts back in 1993? You guessed it, I'm talking about the portly pop star known as Meatloaf, who won everyone's praise for his ballad, "I Would Do Anything for Love." Do you remember what was at the end of that line when he sang with all his heart, "I would do anything for love, but I won't do that"? Which left us all wondering, what won't Meatloaf do for love? It's one of life's big burning questions. Like, where do you draw the line, Mr. Loaf? We all have to know. We have a little bit in common with Meatloaf. We're all up for anything to a point, right? Like maybe the person, when they're asked, like, where do you want to eat? They say, hey, I'm good with anywhere. And then you name a place and they're like, not there, right? Like I could eat anywhere for lunch, but I won't eat there. Or maybe trying to nail down a meeting with someone who says, hey, I'm free whenever. And then you name a time and they say, I can't do it then, right? Our hearts are willing and open, but when the rubber meets the road, we're not always prepared to do that or go there or say when. And that's where we find ourselves today as we take one last look at Jesus' invitation to follow him. In Luke 9, Verse 23, Jesus said to all, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. So to truly trust and know Jesus is to follow him. He's not a box you check, like a to-do list item or a social affiliation. He's not a show or a team that you watch. We don't sit in the stands like fans cheering when we're winning and then hitting the concession stand or turning it off early when it's not going so well. We don't watch from a distance and bail when we get another call. We don't say yes to him like an RSVP and then not go to the wedding because something else came up. The invitation, the offer on the table is to follow him. It requires action, to be a follower, not just a fan. Jesus is offering us the only way to life. And yes, it may feel like loss at times. It will require sacrifice. Jesus said it himself in Luke 9:24. He said, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? Sometime after Jesus gave this invitation, later in Luke chapter 9, as he and his disciples were walking down the road, they encountered three people. The first guy ran up to Jesus and he said in Luke 9:57, I'll follow you wherever you go. Listen to that excitement. He's like, this sounds fantastic. You got power. You got wisdom. Everybody's following you. I'm in. Maybe you said something like this to Jesus at one point. Maybe when you were first awakened to the good news of the gospel and Jesus saved you from your sin. Or maybe when you were in a huge hole and you were crying out and begging. You say, I'll follow you anywhere, Jesus. I feel like I prayed that prayer on several different occasions fighting some kind of bug. Luke 9:58, Jesus responds to that man who said he'll follow him wherever he goes. Jesus said, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's as if Jesus says, wherever, you know I'm homeless, right? Like where I'm going, there will be all kinds of sacrifice and suffering. And the context in Luke kind of leads us to believe that this guy might have had second thoughts. Like, did I say wherever? If the man decided that he was going to follow Jesus, he didn't know where he would be going or if he would even have a place to stay. And maybe that caused some fear in his mind, which could have caused him to say no. In his book, Not a Fan, author and pastor Kyle Idleman writes this, that whenever we're afraid of what a commitment will lead to, our instinctual response is to say no. He goes on to write that fear fills us with questions of what if? What if I get married and she starts to change? What if I take the job and it doesn't work out? What if I'm not successful? What if he wants me to share my faith with my neighbor? What if Jesus wants me to serve and then he points to the homeless shelter? What if Jesus wants me to adopt and then he points overseas? What if he wants me to reconcile and then he points to my family? I remember when Katie and I were praying about planting this church with Chris and Katie. It was the biggest decision we'd ever faced in our marriage, and there were all kinds of what ifs. I mean, we had 10 years of relational equity in our church and around town. I had a good salary with real benefits, a strong, healthy church. We had an incredible small group. We had a Trader Joe's. It was awesome. And we were trying to determine, was God leading us to walk away from all of that? And an older man with some spiritual authority in my life took me to lunch and he started pointing out all these things. And he said, you need to think about your wife and your children. And then he said this, I'll never forget it. He said, if you were my son, I'd say, don't do this. And at that time, maybe on paper, he was right. But I knew in my heart that I had told Jesus that I would follow him and that meant wherever. So if that meant taking a pay cut, uprooting my family, moving to a new place to start a new thing that we didn't know if would make it or not, then wherever. The next guy that Jesus encounters on the road, Jesus actually initiates the conversation. He says, follow me. And the guy says in Luke 9:59, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. This man seems willing to follow. The first word out of his mouth is Lord. He seems to understand what's going on here. He's giving Jesus a title of master. He's taking the position of servant. He says Lord. But the second word out of his mouth is first. It's like he wants to follow Jesus, but now's not the best time. And you might be thinking, like, the guy wants to go bury his father. What is the big deal with that? And I've read where some scholars have said this guy's family might have still been alive, that this was just a figure of speech, something cultural that meant he was still helping on the family farm, or maybe his family wouldn't have approved, so he was waiting on them to pass on before he followed Jesus. And maybe that was the case. Or maybe we just don't like how hardcore Jesus seems to be right here. He's making a serious point. And I think the point is that when Jesus calls us to follow, the answer is whenever, not later. And I'm pretty good at planning to do things later. One of my daughters has my gift. I think they call it procrastination. But how many times have you said you'd start eating better after the holidays? Right? Like, we're there right now. The only problem is we're in America and there's a holiday every single day. There's always an occasion to put that off until tomorrow. We love the snooze button, and we use it with Jesus too. We'll get in a small group next time around. We'll start going to church when the kids get a little older. We'll start giving when we make a little more money. We love tomorrow. We confidently believe that our future self will be ready to do whatever it is, just not today. And what Jesus is saying to this man and to us is that he's inviting us to follow him right now. The author of Hebrews in chapter 3, verse 15 says, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Wherever he leads, whenever he calls, and whatever he asks." The third guy on the road comes up to Jesus in verse 61. And he says, "I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home." And Jesus said to him, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." Now, you may be looking for the hint now. This guy says, "Yes, Lord, but." This is probably where we get the words to the song, "I've decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back." Jesus says, once you start following me, you don't need to turn back. He's calling us to be all in. I remember when I stopped running from God and said, "Yes, Lord, I'll follow you." Yeah, there were some things in my past that he wanted me to walk away from. Some bad habits, some false beliefs, some unhealthy relationships. We don't hold a few things back from Jesus just in case we're going to need them later. We don't give parts of our lives to Jesus, but not all of our lives. It just doesn't work that way. I recently read an interesting story about a group called the Knights Templar. I don't know if you're familiar with them. These guys were part of the Crusades in the 12th and 13th centuries. Maybe it would help if I gave you a visual. Remember the guy who was guarding the Holy Grail in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? If you haven't seen that movie, do yourself a solid. It's still Thanksgiving weekend. Go and watch that. You'll see this guy. Maybe it was one guy like that. Apparently, when some of the knights would be baptized by the church, they would be baptized with their swords. They'd be holding their swords. But the interesting thing is, as they were going back underwater, they wouldn't let their sword go underwater with them. They'd hold the sword up out of the water while the rest of their body was immersed. It was like saying to Jesus, "You can have most of me, but you can't have this." Like, Jesus, I'm all yours, but who I am on the battlefield and who I am when I wield this sword, that's not part of the deal. And it begs a question, doesn't it? What would I hold up out of the water? What am I holding back? What am I keeping tucked away? What part of my life, what room in the house of my life has a different lock on it that I have not given Jesus a key to? You know, it was different for various peoples who encountered Jesus. For Nicodemus in John 3, it was his religious reputation. For the rich young ruler in Mark 10, it was his stuff. For this guy here in Luke 9, it was his family. Maybe even his old life. Jesus has a way of knowing the things that we want to hold back from him. And you know what? It might not even be a bad thing. It might just be that we've made it a big thing, or perhaps the biggest thing. He doesn't want our divided attention or our divided affection. And so he's going to point out those things that we value most or that we worry about the most. And he's going to say, what about that? Will you trust me with that? For some of us, he may be asking, what about food? You know, maybe you turn to food as a source of comfort and satisfaction, and it's becoming unhealthy. Maybe Jesus will ask, what about your entertainment choices? Maybe you keep turning back to shows or sites that don't take you to healthy places in your minds. Maybe he's asking, what about your kids? You know, maybe you'd say you're a follower of Jesus as long as your life can revolve around your kids. What about your money? Perhaps that's the area of your life that you're holding up out of the water. You're keeping it back from Jesus because you're just not sure he'll take care of you. here's the reality. Jesus isn't really after your money. He's not after your kids. He's not after your latest show that you're watching on Netflix. He's not after your donuts. He's after your heart. He loves you. He died for you so that he could rescue you and transform every single part of you. He knows that you will not have true life if he has to share you with anything or anyone else. He knows that the one thing that we are most reluctant to give up is the one thing that could become a substitute for him. And that one thing could steal the life he died to give us. When Jesus says, "Follow me," it's a wherever, whenever, and whatever invitation. So let me ask you 3 questions to think about today and in the coming days. Number 1, where is Jesus leading that you've not wanted to go? Is there a place he's called you to follow him, to your home, to your neighborhood, to your job, but you've not wanted to go there with him? Number 2, when are you going to say yes to him and stop hitting snooze? Is there something that he's been inviting you into, to follow him into, and you said, yeah, I'll do that later? It's time to turn off the alarm and say yes to him. And here's the last question. What have you been holding back from him? What is it? What area of your life, or what thing, or what person or relationship are you keeping behind your back or holding from him, not sure what he might do with it? Will you trust him with it? Where Jesus is saying, what about that? The beauty of the gospel is that Jesus has died and rose again to free us from the slavery of sin, to empower us to follow him, to give us the courage that we need to trust him. He has our best at heart. What may feel like loss at first will become a story of faith and power and growth for you. I think about that man who told me to think about my wife and my kids when I was considering leaving a stable job to plant a new church. You know what I'd say to him today? I'd say I was thinking about my wife and my kids. I absolutely was thinking about them and what I would be teaching them if we stayed safe, as opposed to stepping out in faith and trusting God that wherever he leads, we will go. I wanted them to experience the adventure of leaping out and following him, so that one day they would do the same. What about you? This week begins a season that we call Advent, where we get excited about and anticipate and wait for the arrival of Jesus, celebrating his birth, trusting that he will come again. It's that time of year when we sing, "Let every heart prepare him room." And I'm praying that this Christmas, with all that's going on around us, that we hear and respond to Jesus when he says, "Follow me."